Hello, I'm Nolan, and I designed Shatterseal, which won the Monster Hunter Wilds weapon design contest. Thank you to everybody who voted for it and supported the design, and shoutouts to all the other entrants who came up with just so many creative, inspiring designs. Obviously, thanks to the team at Capcom, who actually had to put it into the game, modeling, rigging, animating, texturing, VFX, everything that goes into something like this, because it's such an undertaking. And on top of actually having to work on the rest of the game and the expansion, I know my design was a little out there, so it cannot have been easy, but it looks incredible. So I cannot wait for everybody to get their hands on it and see how it feels to use in game. Anyways, I just thought it might be interesting to make a video sort of going over my process and talking about what I like to think about when I design stuff. So to begin with, I just started sketching out a bunch of ideas for hunting horns, hammers, dual blades, bowguns, and this sort of cat tower idea with them popping out and holding the weapon for you, as well as some gun lances. And this sketch led into my first finalized design, which was the Splintering Tempest. And this ended up being one of my more reserved, kind of grounded designs, in so much as you can call a boat that you stab monsters with, like, reserved and grounded. But I was still pretty proud of it for all this mechanical detail with the framework around the cannon, as well as the way it sort of interacts with the hull to form this broken stabbing tip. The way wyvern fire looks through these wooden slats was really interesting to me too, because this is one of those design elements that I'm a big fan of, where you have this high contrast, high saturation area, but you restrict it to a small space, and that creates an area of high visual interest, but it doesn't overwhelm the viewer because of how small that space is where it's emanating from. Despite how happy I was with this design though, after I'd seen so many crazy ideas from other entrants, I just wasn't sure if this would be able to compete. So I went back to the drawing board, and something great about the design process is that regardless of how rough an early idea might be, or how bad you think it looks, you can always repurpose it and refine and apply it to new contexts. So in the case of the shield for Splintering Tempest, one early idea was for this ghost girl trapped in a mirror, and that ended up informing the design for Shatterseal, with this kind of princess trapped in a mirror. Breaking the blade with her in it felt aggressive and kind of mean-spirited though, so I swapped her out for the monster that you see in the final design. And that felt like a better fit for the kind of aggressive nature of these broken shards. I also did one more design based on those initial concepts for that cat tower idea, the feline symphony. And I still really like this idea. It's just really silly. But after working on it for a while, I realized that it had gotten so complicated that it was probably not feasible. Just because there's 5 different cats, and they each have their own little instrument. They'd probably need unique animations. So there was a lot going on here. Same could be said for Shatterseal as well, with the effects and the complicated rigging you need for this reforming model every charge cycle. So prior to submission, I kind of felt that Splintering Tempest was like my only hope at potentially squeaking something into the top 20. Obviously, looking back now, I am so incredibly glad that I pushed myself and these designs as far as I did. So Shatterseal ended up as a pretty high fantasy kind of magical design. I guess you could explain the floating shards with gravitational fields or electromagnetism, but visually it really is pretty far on the magical end of the design spectrum. And I know there's those out there who would prefer a much more grounded, realistic aesthetic, but like I said with Splintering Tempest, it can just be hard for those designs to hold up against something that is more fantastical, simply because the fantasy design is a little more flashy. Now that's not to say that more realistic or grounded designs are any less valid, because it really just depends what you're designing for. I'm a huge fan of historical weapons and armor, and so I think having a familiarity with those really sets a sort of foundation and can only improve your design sensibilities, whether you're designing something more grounded or fantastical. So when thinking of weapon design, the first shape that generally comes to mind is probably your basic generic sword shape, with your blade, your crossguard, and your hilt, maybe a wheel pommel. And this is extremely effective because of its simplicity, and that makes it really iconic. Because even at a distance, essentially what it is a long line with a smaller line going through it at these sort of proportions, which is about 20/80. But from this basic form, there are so many possibilities where you can take your design. And in Shatterseal's case, the basic silhouette, not counting the shattered form, because obviously that's a lot more complicated, but the repaired form, the silhouette is essentially a basic sword with a wider blade and the tip chopped off. And a hole punched in it. It's a little rough, but at a distance, that is basically what you see when you look at the finished product. So Shatterseal did end up being a bit of a departure from your standard sword silhouette, but within a specific category like European longswords, the tiniest minute details can really alter the way that a design feels. It's kind of similar to how fonts work with different typeface. So something like this will feel completely different to something like this. And even though the words are conveying the same meaning, the aesthetic conveys a completely different feeling. And that's only through use of these tiny little serifs at the essentially edge of the silhouette, as well as a bit more refinement in the way these lines thin out, whereas these remain uniform. So these really tiny, subtle changes are enough to make a design feel completely different. And that's something I think a lot about when I'm trying to play around with shapes or alter a silhouette, where my favorite European longsword type is probably the Oakshot type 18B, with this long, narrow blade and really interesting sort of tapering hilt. My favorite aspect of it would probably be that the hilt ends up just about as wide as the blade, so it forms these long, continuous lines down the length of the sword. And I think with katana, the reason I find these so appealing as well is the same thing, where the width of the blade kind of coincides with the width of the hilt, creating this long unbroken line. And something about my own designs that I like to include are these sort of long unbroken lines, both in my paintings as well as my designs, because they're a good way to break up a composition or lead the viewer's eye to where you want them to look. As for Shatterseal, the nature of a broken mirror is inherently kind of chaotic and a bit of a jumbled mess. So obviously when I designed this, I didn't want it to just be, a jumbled mess, but I wanted to retain some of that chaos while being just that little bit more orderly. So if you'll notice, I arranged the shards, and it's clear on this little color chart here, but I arranged the shards in a way that forms these sort of through lines running down the length of the blade. And I wanted to give the viewer a way to sort of get through the design without focusing too much on like the individual shards and kind of being overly visually stimulating. So that leads into the next topic, which would be focal points and detailing. So on Shatterseal, my focal point was the hole where the eye is. And to create the focal point, I kind of concentrated all my detail around that area with these small shards you see. And what's interesting about things like impact sites and craters is that they sort of form natural focal points where all these lines radiate outwards from them and visually point directly at that singular point. Another way of directing attention to a focal point is with color. So the Buster Sword obviously is this incredibly iconic, simple design that's just really well executed. But what's interesting is that these materia, on top of having in-game mechanics tied into them, are also just the tiniest pops of color on this massive blade. So what's interesting is that despite being so small in surface area, the attention they draw to this area of the blade makes for a really strong focal point, and it's just this subtle touch that is so effective. Something that really exemplifies how I like to think about detail is mechanical design. So on this fighter jet engine, you can see all this detail, which is all functional, but there's so much going on that it is kind of hard to tell what to look at. But obviously in the finished product, they'll cover that with plating and make it more aerodynamic. Add some panel lines for visual interest, and then you get this nice clean look. But the big thing is that you still get that little hint of detail restricted to a small area. So this is your focal point, and this is your cleaner sort of place where you can rest visually. An interesting way to reintroduce more detail is you just blow a hole in it. And then you can add like oil dripping out or flames for some more brightness and saturation contrast. And this is true for Gundam models as well, where they start with a highly detailed mechanical frame and then cover it with armor plating. But they also leave certain parts exposed, and that is where you get your extra little bits of mechanical detail, where there are joints and gaps in the armor, so you can see through to that detailed inner frame. And the same thing applies here as well, where you can just kind of punch a hole in it, and that will expose all the hidden mechanical detail underneath. So you can have these nice supporting steel frames, a bunch of tubing and pipes. Because when you're designing, you can do whatever you want with it. You can break it apart, you can attach giant weapons to the side, you can put armor on it. It's just knowing how and where to apply detail that kind of elevates your design. So also knowing when to simplify. Like maybe this is too complicated, so you just erase a couple of those lines, and then you have a more open space. So there's a lot to think about, but the main thing is just to keep a good balance between detail and more simplified areas. So on the repaired form, I kind of swapped out the shard detail for the more organic appearance of the monster trapped in the blade, because as a design, the sort of normal repaired blade is pretty simple, but overlaying that silhouette of the monster's face in there adds just enough, I think, to make both forms pretty interesting. Although the shattered form is kind of leaning too overcomplicated, I think that kind of works out for the design because it's just the nature of broken glass. What I find so interesting about Greatsword and Monster Hunter weapons in general as a design platform is that the movesets are so in-depth and involved to where you have multiple charge states, transformations, power-up states, all sorts of different effects and actions that integrate directly into the gameplay and can change the visuals of your design. So playing into those sorts of design elements makes it so that these weapons are such a great foundational platform to design off of. So after establishing the silhouette and sort of the primary design elements, it can be helpful to reference sort of the way things are made to add that extra bit of complexity. So with katana, something I love about the blades is the hamon, which is the temper line pattern that's formed as a result of the heat treating process. So when heating the blade, the blacksmith applies clay to the spine, and then during the quench, that allows the edge to harden for better cutting performance, while the spine remains softer and more impact resistant. And that sort of delineation between the two hardnesses creates this gorgeous pattern. And there are all sorts of different possibilities for that with hitatsura and notare. This one is choji. But it's that sort of knowledge of how this thing is made that can really add to something. With that being said, though, I think when you're trying to design something, you should really take inspiration from anywhere and everywhere, because there's so much out there in the world that if you are only looking at weapons while designing a weapon, you run the risk of kind of getting stuck in that box where you're like, this is what a weapon looks like, and it can be hard to deviate from that kind of mindset. Whereas if you're looking at like trees getting torn in half by lightning strikes, or how glaciers form, or like animal spines, or whatever the hell, like there are so many interesting things out there in the world that it would be a shame to not take inspiration and let your creativity run wild. But anyways, something about Monster Hunter that I really appreciate is that its ideas are so creatively free while maintaining this sort of high level of research and well thought out concepts that result in ideas like creatures and armor and weapons that feel like they could exist in this world. With Clavinus, one of my favorite examples of this, the big idea is just T-Rex with a giant sword tail, which is inherently cool. So I think it's good to start a concept where your big idea is the main interesting point about it, and then go from there, adding detail and interest to flesh out the concept. With Clavinus, the fact that his flame breath, when he grabs the tail, heats it up and tempers it like a blacksmith, really kind of brings out that depth. On top of that, if you know anything about how steel reacts to heat, it oxidizes at different temperatures, so it goes from this gold to a deep purple and then a brilliant blue, which you can see reflected on the tail here. It's not just any random colors plopped on there because, oh, they might look good, but it's a well thought out result of these physical processes that actually exist in real life, applied to an already cool design that just elevates it. And that's something I strive to achieve with my own designs, and why I'm so honored that Shatterseal is now a part of that well-realized world. As a side note about realism in design, if you'll notice on Shatterseal, the edge bevel is pretty narrow for how thick the blade is. But if you know anything about sharpening, you'll realize that this translates to a pretty dull edge, because that acts as more of a wedge than something with enough space to thin out to a proper cutting edge. But this is one of those things where if you know about how it works, then you can break that rule if you want something that is more visually appealing. Because I think the proportion of a narrow bevel to a wider shard here is more interesting than something that is more symmetrical. Small detail on the final version I appreciate is that they've also added these striations, which indicate marks from a grinding wheel where they've sharpened that bevel. Going back to that thing about color saturation and focal points, I also love how the sides of these glass shards add that little pop of green, which isn't visible from the front, but you turn it just a little bit and you get this nice color contrast that really adds to the more reserved palette. Another thing I think they did really well on with the final version of Shatterseal is this shard here, because something I've noticed about greatswords is that they tend to be kind of blocky or chunky just because of the way this hilt goes right into the blade and makes these sort of hard 90-degree angles without that same sense of flow that a longsword has, where the blade is more or less coinciding with the handle. But in a few Monster Hunter designs I've seen, they like to do this thing where they add this little guard or other sort of transitional element to soften that angle and make for a more flowing design. And so that's what I tried to emulate with this piece here on Shatterseal, where you kind of get that flow line going. But I think in the final version, they've done it a lot more elegantly with this shard in particular, where they left a little bit in the hilt and then broke this piece off to the side. And then finally, this nice jagged edge here kind of makes for that nicer transition. It is so well done. And this is a bit of a tangent, but if you've ever noticed those people with giant cosplay swords swinging them around and they hit something, a lot of the time it will end up just landing flat. And this is because they haven't really thought about the handle construction, because they've made it cylindrical. Whereas if you've ever handled a real sword, they're generally oval or more squared off, or maybe like a pole arm might be octagonal or hexagonal. And these shapes provide alignment with your edge, whereas a cylinder gives you no like reference point. So if you're even slightly off during a cut, especially on a really wide blade, that ends up torquing sideways. And with a cylinder, you have nothing sort of preventing that. Whereas with a standard sword grip, you have this verticality to keep the blade from turning in your hands. So while visually, I think cylinders are a little more appealing and funny when people use them, in practicality, it's really interesting how such a small change to the shape of it affects the performance. So I ended up talking quite a bit about a lot of topics, and I'm not sure if all of it was exactly relevant or useful or even interesting, but hopefully someone out there will have gotten something from it. Now, just as a disclaimer for everything that I've talked about, these are just things that I like to use in my designs. But there are so many valid ways to create something, and so many thousands of artists and designers out there who just want to put something out into the world that they like and want to share with people. So it's perfectly fine to like or dislike a design, because there's always something out there for you. With that being said, thanks again to anyone who's expressed how much they like my design. I am really glad that it has resonated with so many people. And just the fact that my work has gotten into a series that I hold so dear is really awesome. Little 12-year-old me sitting in the basement playing Monster Hunter Tri at 2 a.m. on a school night, trying to farm Rathian rubies. And I had just cut the tail when my mom showed up, and I begged her to let me keep playing because it was an online game, except I was offline and I was just trying to carve the tail, and all I got was a scale. But that kid would probably be pretty stoked to know that he managed to design a weapon for the newest Monster Hunter.